On the podcast today, we are going to dissect Chapter 28 of the Tao Te Ching, and as usual, Guiyang will read Jia Fu Feng and Jane English's translation, and I will read Derek Lin's translation.
Know the strength of a man, but keep a woman's care. Be the stream of the universe. Being the stream of the universe, ever true and unswerving. Become as a little child once more. Know the white, but keep the black. Be an example to the world. Being an example to the world, ever true and unwavering. Return to the infinite. Know honor, yet remain humble. Be the valley of the universe. Being the valley of the universe, ever true and resourceful. Return to the state of the uncarved block. When the block is carved, it becomes useful. When the wise use it, they become rulers. Thus, a great tailor makes few cuts.
Know the masculine, hold to the feminine. Be the watercourse of the world. Being the watercourse of the world, the eternal virtue does not depart. Return to the state of the infant. Know the white, hold to the black. Be the standard of the world. Being the standard of the world, the eternal virtue does not deviate. Return to the state of the boundless. Know the honor, hold to the humility. Be the valley of the world. Being the valley of the world, the eternal virtue shall be sufficient. Return to the state of plain wood. Plain wood splits, then becomes tools. The sages utilize them, and then become leaders. Thus, the greater whole is undivided. First thing we should mention is when Jia Fu Feng and Jane English mention man and woman, we are talking here about yang and yin.
Yes.
Derek's translation does mention masculine and feminine, so we're talking about principles here, principle energetic qualities we all have within us.
Yes.
And so that's just a bit of housekeeping, because some people that read this in English can become confused as to what that means. But in some sense, there are character traits, obviously, with what Jia Fu Feng and Jane English are saying with men and women. But the essence of it in Chinese is yin and yang. And so even though that's a poetic translation, it's trying to get you into that understanding of the yang and yin principles of the universe.
Yes. It's not about role based on gender difference or anything like that. It's all about the principle, universal principle and difference in between masculine and feminine.
Yes. And so we find in this chapter many of the same metaphors we find all throughout the Tao Te Ching, where we have the watercourse, we have the kind of standard, ordinary state of mind and the world and being, and also the valley. And on top of that, we have the uncarved block, or what Derek calls plain wood. But the more common terminology is the uncarved block.
Yes.
And so to differentiate that between the carved block, we have those two philosophies within the Warring States period of China, where Lao Tzu says we should stick to the uncarved block, but Confucius has the carving and polishing metaphor, where we should train ourselves, cultivate our character, and Lao Tzu says that this is what actually leads to corruption when you start to cultivate, trying to go through the self-cultivation method. He believes we should stick to nature, the uncarved block, and we'll get more into that.
Yes.
But how that relates to just the watercourse way of nature and the ultimate principle of Uchi.
Yes. Uncarved block itself has its truest form of nature. When it's carved, it still has that form of nature, real truest form of nature, but because it's carved, so like as you mentioned, it's somewhat corrupted, that nature is somewhat modified, manipulated for what's needed to be in certain look when you carve the wooden block. So it doesn't contain the purest form of nature anymore.
No, that's right. And that's the point of this chapter. That's why Lao Tzu begins with saying, know the masculine, but hold to the feminine, because what we see in the world today is we live in a yin-deficient world. So we're not residing in the yin. We're constantly in the yang. We're out there busy doing, and we have this very extroverted sense of success. where this chapter is kind of leaning more into Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, right? The inner journey that we need to go on as people of spirituality or people on the spiritual path, no matter whether it's Taoism, Buddhism, or Hinduism, on that deeper journey within to the greater ocean. Call it Tao, call it Brahman, call it whatever you will. And so it's not in being young oriented that we actually achieve that. And I think that that's the con job that has been pulled on the world, is that people are under the belief that if they're out there doing, and gaining all of these achievements and climbing the ladder of success, that this will lead to some sort of form of ultimate contentment. And we all know that that's not true, and that's not the case, because when we do climb one mountain, as William Walker Atkinson says, we look up and there's another higher mountain to climb. And so when are you going to pull up stumps and say, enough is enough, I need to find happiness and contentment right where I am?
Yes. The hero's journey in Joseph Campbell's work in the book, The Hero with 1,000 Faces, the hero here meaning, as you mentioned, it's an inner journey that you're going through the transformation. You begin the journey and you meet the mentor, you go through the adventurous experience in your life, and you go through death and rebirth fates, and also you come to atonement and you return and you complete the journey. So beginning of the journey and the end of the journey ends up at the same place. That's the paradox of the story in this hero's journey.
Yep.
So that is to say that beginning of the journey and end of the journey, the destination and the starting point is exactly the same. So you would say, what was the journey for, really? Again, here we are talking that in that sense, journey as in linear form, getting from A to B, the very conventional way of thinking to achieve something, right? So you should be at a different place if you achieved something, exactly, right? But in this term, the hero's journey, it's something completely different. It's inner journey that you go through. So when you arrive to the end of the journey, destination of the journey, what the difference that you make is to have that elevated perception of yourself and the world. That's the difference. And that state of mind is, I guess, somewhat, you can call it awakened state of mind or enlightened state of mind, something like that. Your perception has completely changed from going through the journey. Yeah. So you come to realization, actually, beginning of the journey and the destination of the journey was actually exactly ends up in the same place. So here, yin and yang, and masculine and feminine, beginning and the end, polar opposite. When it meets in a perfect balance, it all ends in the same place. So realizing that fact is what this hero's journey is about.
Yeah. Mutual interdependence, isn't it?
Yes.
It really is. Like when we talk about yin and yang, we're not actually talking about opposites. We're talking about mutual interdependence. Like they're both aspects of the whole of the Tao, because if we look at metaphysical psychology of Taoism, as I mentioned in other podcasts, we have Uchi, which is the ultimate nothingness, where everything arises from, that infinite space. And then you have Tai Chi, which is the Tao of movement, which is the movement of energy out of the potentiality that was within the nothingness.
Yes.
That creates the universe, and then Tai Chi creates the polar opposites, the yin and yang of the universe, that keeps the universe in balance. Because if it was one or the other, the universe would be out of balance. It needs the opposites to bring balance. And this is why men and women complement each other. And this is why other things, light and dark, high and low, mutually interdependent opposites.
Yes.
And so And in elaborating a little bit more on what you were saying, particularly with the linear journey, it's more of a circular pattern, isn't it? When what Campbell was talking about, we start here, we go on the hero's journey, but we arrive back where we were.
Where we were, yes.
And it's kind of analogous to those of us who have travelled in our life to other parts of the world that are far different from our own culture. We all know this. Well, people who have travelled extensively know this, where you'll leave your birth country and you'll go to some other country that's polar opposite to your country, and you learn all of these new things. You learn about the culture. It humbles you in a sense, because you can't act as an American or a Korean or Australian if you go to India, for example. You have to just do as they do. And you have to accept it. And if you try to fight that, then you'll be on a plane quick smart, because you just won't survive. But then what you find is when you go back to your birth country, you realize that you are way different from the people who remained in that country. Even your friends and your family, you'll see that there's a big gap between you and them, because you've gone on the hero's journey in a physical form. But the physical journey evoked an eternal journey, an eternal response to what was happening. Because if you are a Korean and you go to India, good luck trying to be a Korean in India. You have to do things as they do. So the natural inner journey is evoked from the outer journey. And actually, Joseph Campbell does talk about this in some of his books. And so that is what's important. But again, you go back to the beginning where you're completely different. You've gone on that journey. Everyone else is the same. And this is why, in some sense, some people who have gone on that journey will struggle when they go back to their home country or their home city or whatnot, because those people, other people are the same. You've changed, but they see you as the person before the hero's journey.
Yes.
Before you had woken up. And sometimes they don't respect and appreciate where you are on your journey in life. And so what happens is, usually people, when they go back to their country and their city or whatnot, the topic of conversation with the people that they're familiar with is pre the journey.
Yes.
But when they go back to the countries and that they've been familiar with from traveling, then the people that they meet, the conversations are much more deeper, yes, at a deeper level.
Yeah, it's interesting thing, because you sometimes find it it's a strange feeling after you've gone through all different countries and traveling, and you come back to the same place, and you're thinking like, all those months or years of time while you were traveling, all the people back home were doing exactly the same they were doing before you left your traveling. So all those months or years of time, those people back home were doing exactly the same thing that which they were doing while you were experiencing something completely different. So yes, it is somewhat a bit of a trip, isn't it?
It is a trip, it is.
Yeah.
But that's the spiritual journey, isn't it? And unfortunately, only a very tiny minority discover the spiritual path. And George Ivanovich Gurdjieff, Armenian mystic, said that that's kind of meant to be that way. You know, it's not everyone is supposed to wake up in this life. But if you're one of those fortunate enough, then if you're listening or watching this podcast, then this is what Joseph Campbell would call the great boon. Because you've gone on that hero's journey and you're bringing back the great boon to just your ordinary life. But it's something you have within yourself. It's not something you can give to someone. Maybe you could, share some wisdom with someone else, but it's not something that you can tangibly share with someone, because you've got it within yourself. And other people who have it too, because you look at them in the eye and they've had that experience as well. They've gone on that journey as well. And it's a lifetime journey, because once you find that path, once you find the spiritual path, I've never really ever seen anyone that's departed from that journey.
Yes. Yeah, once you have tasted it, once you have fully immersed into that kind of experience, that all these things that you get to do in society and chase things and goal-oriented mind, all these things like kind of disappears. It just evaporates, right? And you feel much more complete, somewhat like completely fulfilled inside, right? Something that you've done of your own, and that experience only nourishes you to live your life much more fulfillingly.
Yeah. And that relates to exactly what Lao Tzu is saying in this chapter,
Yeah.
isn't it? That in residing in the yin, in the nothingness and the non-doing of life, that's where the great contentment and the spiritual path
Yes.
resides. It's
Yes.
not in being young-oriented, as you
Yes.
said. Being young-oriented, being active and being a go-getter, you don't have any contentment or happiness. That never is evoked from that mentality.
Yes.
Look at the billionaires who can't stop trying to accumulate money and creating artificial goals for themselves. They create things in their mind to chase because they still think that if they get to the next goalpost, then that's when they'll have the happiness. And it's like, no, you've already got $1 billion. Settle down. You don't need to work a day in your life ever again. Dedicate your life to peace, to being shanti, to the path of wu-wei, of non-interference and non-doing. And just allow life to be as it will and follow the watercourse of the world, which is flowing through you. But when we're young-oriented, the watercourse of the Tao we are out of sync with, because we're either holding onto the banks of the river or we're fighting the current of the Tao, and that's how you don't experience any virtue. But once you let go, as I always say on the podcast, the river's power becomes your power. That's what the is. That's the Tao. That's the virtue of the Tao moving through you. The potentiality in nothingness. So when you reside in Uchi, which is in Taoism, the ultimate goal is to abide in that state of Uchi more often than not through the principle of Yin, then there's a potentiality there, just as the potentiality of the Tao in Uchi arose as Tai Chi, as movement, and created the whole universe. You create your life by abiding in the Yin, abiding in Uchi, and that's where the great potential is. That doesn't mean that that potential is going to be climbing the stock market or climbing the ladder of success in Wall Street. It doesn't mean that, but it means you will climb the ladder of true success, of being in harmony with nature and finding contentment and happiness in your life through humility and compassion and forgiveness.
Yes, again, when you reside in Yang, meaning when you get lost in this material world, right, and you just only seeing that, so kind of very one-sided way of seeing reality, then you only know chasing and achieving goals and again working on the way you look and worrying about how other people think of you and whatnot. So you are not sovereign of your own life, right? You're driven by external world, manifested world's values, which is we know that's superficial, very business-oriented and materialistic and whatnot. So when we get lost in that world, we just trying, right, to make something work or achieve your goals and whatnot. But then we all experience this, we get so tired, we get too exhausted, meaning that there is a limit to that kind of effort, right? But when you become effortless, it's a whole different story. That's why, again, Lao Tzu talks over and over about how it's important to be like an infant baby in uncarved block and knowing humility and whatnot, because once we understand the quality of humility, then you become more resourceful. Why? Because you don't need to try anymore. You don't have to put so much effort anymore. Why? Once we reside in the humble state, the yin place, again, the river's power becomes your power. You become resourceful. Why? Again, the energy of universe, energy of nature becomes yours.
Yeah.
You no longer need to try anymore. Just from being humble and reside in that humility, that power, Tao's power becomes your power.
Yeah. That's an important point, because one of the hallmarks of this chapter, and a lot of chapters within the Tao Te Ching, is how we lose innocence from following that young-oriented, goal-oriented path, where we become a know-it-all, we become dog-headed, and we lose our natural sense of innocence to allow the world to be. You have to have a sense of innocence, true, pure innocence, a purity of heart, to allow the world to be as it will. The reason why people interfere with the process of life, they follow the path of interference as opposed to the path of non-interference of Wu Wei, is because they don't have the innocence of heart. They have an agenda for the world that's in their own mind that they want to superimpose onto the world. And that's where all trouble comes from. And it's ironic that if we look at most of the innocent cultures within the world, they're more yin-oriented, and they have that real childlike innocence that, in some sense, especially as people coming from the developed world, when you're around people, say in the third world, in air quotes, is you feel a little embarrassed, because when you're around some of these people and they have true purity of heart, no spiritual BS is needed on top. They have true purity of heart and pure innocence. You almost feel embarrassed a little bit to be around them, because you're like, well, there are so many things that are wrong with me, because I think I know this, I think I know that, but in the end I don't know any of it.
Yes.
And it's getting worse as we are evolving with technology, because we have a younger generation that when you ask them something, they'll just type it into Google and think that they know a certain subject or something that you've asked them. And as we know, you can't learn everything off Wikipedia. You can't learn everything off Google. You have to actually have felt experiences and read books that are dedicated to certain knowledge to understand the kernel of truth. And so the irony with that is that because we're creating such an artificial digital dynamic where you can just type into Google, what is Taoism, and it'll give you like a 2-sentence definition. And then a young person or even an older person will say, well, that's what it is. And it's like, well, that's not really what it is. Like, you can't explain it in 2 sentences. Like, and so because we're creating that sort of world, people are becoming far more materialistic, because things then become artifacts, become objects of knowledge, and are something that you shouldn't delve deeply into. And so in a young-oriented world, what becomes, as you mentioned, what becomes the focus? Our physical appearance, our status, everything that's external becomes what's important. So what do you find then? You find gyms full of people trying to work on their appearance. You find nail parlors, hairdressers, now this new trend with male barbershops. And so it's all about external appearance. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't be presentable and this and that, but it's kind of ironic that you have all of these things but we don't have meditation halls in cities. We don't have places for Qigong, Tai Chi Chuan, yoga. I mean, yeah, there are places that you pay to go and see, but like a meditation hall, for example, in cities should be sort of part of the city, just as a park is, where people can go in and bring their mind back into equanimity. And so when we have a materialistic world, we are focused on how we look, our jobs, how people perceive us is the big thing that keeps us hostage. And the path that we're talking about today, the spiritual path, is the reverse opposite. So instead of being so hell-bent on, I'm going to go to the gym today and this and that, you're more focused on meditation, on quiet contemplation, on learning something deeply. And this is actually what really brings you more fulfillment. Now, I'm not saying you can't incorporate the gym in there in your day. Of course you can. But the problem is when that becomes the primary focus in our life, as opposed to the inner journey that we've been speaking about.
Yes. Again, everything became kind of commodity, like object of achieve or know and this and that. But when we talk about the spiritual path, especially Eastern traditional wisdom traditions, that when we talk about, it is not object of knowledge. It's not an object to know. So you can read so many books, but if it's not felt, you basically waste of your time. You read nothing because it's not an object to knowledge. It's actually, this knowledge is knowing itself. It's you will only truly know when you actually experienced or felt. Then it becomes yours. It's no longer an object. It became just such a subject itself, and you became that knowing itself. Then you can say, I have felt, or I have had experience of this knowledge.
Yeah, that's what jnana is in Sanskrit, right? Jnana means knowledge, but means to know what you're saying. It's the not really the felt. Well, it is a felt experience too, but it's the knowing itself.
Knowing itself, yes.
Like as the same as gnosis, right? Gnosis and jnana are the same. Is to know, is the knowledge of the self, of the ultimate reality, that you know that you can't. Well, you obviously can learn it in a sense from a book, but it's not an actual felt experience. You can know about it and have a framework for it, and that is important to have, because there's another opposite to that is if you don't have a framework, and people can become a bit flaky and think that they are a guru or something like this, but that's not the way it is. And so that what you are saying you can't get from anything. I mean, you can't go to the gym and get it. You can't get it through a book.
Yes.
You can't go to the cinema and watch it. It's something that you abide in. And again, to abide in that, as I mentioned with the Taoism's metaphysical structure, is that Uchi is coming back more into that yin. You're moving back in towards more yin and being more humble and being more soft. This is, again, puts people off, particularly in the developed world and the Western world, because humility, in some sense, has become diminished because of the way societies have developed, where being soft and being humble is thought of as being weak, because how can you become successful that way? And so true success, spiritual success, as we're talking about, is leaning into that, not worrying about whether you're going to get that job or you're going to be the president of Zimbabwe or what have you.
Yes.
So it's leaning into that, leaning into the soft instead of leaning into the hard, and embracing that. And it frightens a lot of people, because as we see in the YouTube comments sometimes, is that what you and I say offends some people who don't want to embrace humility. And I find that really weird, because how do you see humility as a negative? And that means that those individuals have gone lock stock into the yang way of life and think that there's actually nothing to get from the yin way of life. They think that just having, like, being humble is something that is not beneficial at all for you. But those who follow the soft path, follow the path of yin, they understand that, wow, there's really a power in humility. That's why in Taoism they use the water analogy, where water is the softest element in the world, and it always seeks the lowest places, but paradoxically it's the most powerful force in nature. Likewise, that's what humility is. And so those who have it have that power. That's why I wrote my book, The Science and Practice of Humility. And I used examples like Bhagwan Sri Ramana Maharshi, where he was in silence all the time. He didn't conflict with the world. He didn't interfere with people's lives. But then people were drawn to him because he had that humble power that drew people into him like he was a magnet. It's almost like a power of magnetism.
Yes. It's very sad that a lot of people don't understand the true value of being humble. Those people who don't understand what it really means to be humble is, I just have to say, there is no depth in their knowing, really. Mm-hmm. There is no depth. That's why they only value what they can see and what they can feel physically. Again, it's just the superficial values. That's what they think is important. But again, that's very shallow. There is no depth. But if you understood the way nature works, then humility and being in that place along with the water, that's where we should be. And that is most natural path for all of us, because we are also nature. Yep. And it doesn't, that law of nature doesn't really lie at all. That always, it's absolute.
Yep. Well, that's what the uncarved block metaphor is, right? It's holding to that pure nature as it is. And the challenge for us as human beings is, can we hold to our nature as we are? And so our nature as we are is to have humility, because we naturally have humility. We naturally have innocence. We all remember when we were kids, we all had that until socialization happened. And then once we endure that process, then we become hard, and we have a hard edge, and then we lose our humility, we lose our empathy for others, and we become self-interested. And so then, once you fall down that path, it's hard to disentangle from the webs of society. But the spiritual path is about disentangling from those webs of society and working on your conditioning, working on the socialization process you've endured, so that you can come back into that. And it's actually not that hard when you think about it. And it comes back to you just like if you haven't ridden a push bike for many years, but you can just jump on the bike and off you go. That's how simple it really is. Because it's your innate nature, as Mencius actually said as well. It's your innate virtues: humility, innocence, compassion, empathy, forgiveness. These are our innate qualities as human beings that get suppressed as we go through education and we go into working life and we live in a world full of vultures. And so that's what happens to us.
Yeah, so to keep that essence of this spiritual path in this world full of vultures is to have that concentration, isn't it? Concentration, being mindful of your own actions, on your senses, and keep repeating it to remind yourself not to forget. We have so much distractions in the world, and we easily forget. Again, then we get caught into these dramas of our lives, and our mind is start going without us catching it, right? So just repeat and the concentration, and doing that itself is going to make a huge difference, I think.
100%. And the more you bring it back to that, the more you reside as the uncarved block. And from that place, from that Uchi stillness, nothingness, the beauty of life comes. That's the fact of the matter. And people think the beauty of their own lives comes from being busy, gaining things, having possessions, possessing people. But it doesn't. Yeah. It comes from coming back into your nature, because that's the real beauty. We can say, if we look at a tree, because Lao Tzu does use wood as an analogy, a tree naturally is beautiful. Is it beautiful when we carve it into planks for floorboards, for example? Yes, we can have a beautiful floor, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. We all love a good wooden floorboard. But if we were looking just at the tree itself is far more beautiful if we were making a distinction between just sheets of timber and
Yes.
a tree. So when we come back to our nature, that's where the beauty really arises. And that's why, as I mentioned with Bhagwan Sri Ramana Maharshi, that's why people were attracted to him, because he was just like the tree.
Yes. Yes.
Where we're all walking around like floorboards. And we need to realize that we are also wood, even though that we've been carved.
Yes.
Oh.
Innately, someone said that our desire to be free, desire to reach moksha, the liberation itself, is an instinct. Because what happens when we get manipulated by the socializations, or just simply, let's say, when you're a teenager, parents telling you what to do and how to be, what's your natural response to that? You instantly react as a rebel, right? Because you want to be free from that fact that telling you what to do and how to be. You just want to be yourself or what you want to be, right? So just like that, being free is innate to our nature and it's a human instinct. So liberation itself, reaching nirvana, also is an instinctual response. Just like when you mentioned about the tree. Again, in Zhuangzi's story, useless tree becomes how useful it is, how beautiful it is, right? Because it stayed as it is, and it never got chopped down, right?
Yep.
And it offered the most beauty that it could produce to everyone and to the world.
Yep.
So that beauty of the useless tree itself is instinct and nature, innate nature, unpolluted, uncarved as it is, just for the human, it works the same, right? That beauty is when it's not carved, it shines the most.
Yep.
And that is the purest, the truest form of nature of each individual, and that it itself is just our natural instinct.
Yep. And that tree in and of itself brings oxygen to the world, right? You being as you are brings spiritual oxygen to the world. And that's what these great sages do. They bring spiritual oxygen to the world. They've taken off all of the layers of conditioning to come back into their nature, and they are just like that tree, that uncarved block that brings the oxygen to the world. And the oxygen for them is the wisdom they have from coming back into Uchi, coming back into Tao, the Tao of stillness. Once they abide in the Tao of stillness, then they can deliver the deepest knowledge to all of us. And I like how you mentioned, when we go through our process with our parents and with school and whatnot, it's like we are trying on all of these different costumes in life. And every costume feels uncomfortable. You should be like this. So you put on this new costume and you're like, but what happens is we get so accustomed to trying on all of these different suits that because we can adapt as humans. We adjust, we adapt, and then we forget the Tao. We forget that innocence, that humility, the compassion, the empathy, the forgiveness, all gone. Because we've tried on so many suits, we've got so many layers of suits on, we're keeping our money in business.
They all don't fit, actually.
And they don't fit. They're all uncomfortable. Yes. I've never been actually in a suit that's been comfortable. But we're talking here psychological suits. But so you've gone through all of that process, and the problem is we get not that we get comfortable, we tolerate the suits that we have on. We tolerate the layers of conditioning that we've gone through. And this chapter is saying, here's the medicine to take the suits off and to come back to your nature and to get really comfortable in nature as it is, as you are. That's when we get most comfortable. Why do we experience contentment and happiness naturally when we're in that state? Because we're just naturally comfortable. We're not trying to please anybody. We don't care how we look. There's nothing that is of a social concern to those people. And so the sage is the one who has taken all the suits off, has come back to the uncarved block. And that's the process for all of us to go through. And that's what this chapter is talking about.
Yes.
Okay, guys, thank you for watching, and we'll see you guys next time.